In the dust-choked silence of the frontier, where survival meant sacrifice and love was a luxury few could afford, a man with gold in his pockets and ghosts in his heart made an offer no woman should accept, and the one who did changed everything. The wind howled through the broken fence posts like a grieving widow as the wagon rattled to a stop outside the one-room schoolhouse of Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a woman whose name carried more weight than her purse. She'd taught children for 7 winters now, barefoot boys from ranches, girls with sunburned cheeks and ink-stained fingers, all of them hungry not just for food, but for words. Her classroom was a shack with cracked windows and a roof that leaked when it rained, her salary barely enough to buy flour, let alone firewood. But she didn't complain, didn't beg, just stood before her chalkboard each morning, voice steady, eyes bright, teaching them to read, to write, to dream beyond the horizon. That afternoon, as she swept the porch, a shadow fell across the dirt, a massive figure on horseback, his coat stitched with silver thread, his hat wide-brimmed and expensive, his boots polished to a shine even after miles of dust. He dismounted slowly, his gaze sweeping over the schoolhouse, then settling on her. "You're Miss Whitmore," he said, voice gravel and thunder. "I'm Silas Rourke, owner of Blackridge Ranch." She didn't flinch, didn't curtsy, just nodded. "And what brings you here, Mr. Rourke?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the edge of the porch, looked out at the endless plains, then turned back to her. "I need a mother for my sons," he said simply. "And you need shelter." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Not a proposal, not a plea. A transaction. She stared at him, searching for cruelty, for arrogance, for the hunger she'd seen in other men's eyes. But all she found was exhaustion. Quiet, unshakable, terrifying exhaustion. "You think I'm desperate enough to trade my dignity for a roof?" she asked softly. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I think you're tired of watching your students go hungry while you teach them about justice. I think you're tired of patching your dress with thread spun from your own hands. And I think you're tired of being alone." She swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not the preacher who blessed her poverty. Not the sheriff who ignored her pleas for repairs. Not even the townsfolk who called her, the poor teacher, behind closed doors. But this man, he didn't see a charity case. He saw a soul. And that was far more dangerous. Inside the schoolhouse, the scent of chalk dust and dried herbs couldn't mask the tension thickening the air. Eleanor sat behind her desk, fingers trembling as she smoothed the edges of a tattered lesson plan. Silas stood near the door, his massive frame filling the room with quiet strength. He didn't sit, didn't ask for tea, just watched her, his storm-gray eyes holding hers like chains. "Why me?" she finally asked, voice barely audible. "Because you don't flinch," he said quietly. "Because you stand when others cower. Because you've got fire in your bones, and my boys need someone who won't let them burn out." She looked down at her hands, calloused, strong, alive. "And what about you?" she whispered. "What do you need?" He hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in velvet, were 2 tiny pairs of leather shoes, one for each boy. "They lost their mother 3 winters ago," he said, voice rough with memory. "Fever took her, left them hollow-eyed and silent. I tried to raise them myself. But I'm a rancher, not a parent. I can build fences, but I can't mend hearts." Eleanor's throat tightened. No one had ever shown her such vulnerability. Not her father, who'd died in debt. Not her sister, who'd married a gambler and vanished. Not even the students who called her Miss Ellie, with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "You want me to be their mother," she said. "Not your wife." He didn't deny it. "I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for truth. You give them stability. I give you security. No expectations. No vows. Just partnership." She stared at him, searching for deception, for cruelty, for the hunger she'd seen in other men's eyes. But all she found was respect. Quiet, unshakable, terrifying respect. That night, as dusk painted the sky in rose and gold, Eleanor stood at the window, watching him walk to his horse. He didn't look back, didn't call her name, just raised his hand in silent greeting, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she'd forgotten existed: choice. And that choice would change everything. The journey to Blackridge Ranch took 3 days, 3 days of silence, of shared meals by the fire, of stolen glances and unspoken questions. Eleanor rode sidesaddle on a mare Silas had brought for her, her hands gripping the reins with quiet determination, her eyes scanning the horizon like a woman who'd spent her life watching for storms. Behind her, in the wagon, sat the two boys, Thomas, 10 years old with his father's storm-gray eyes and his mother's gentle hands, and Jacob, 7, small for his age, with a stutter that vanished only when he spoke to animals. They didn't speak to her. Didn't smile. Just watched her from beneath the brims of their hats, their faces pale and drawn, their silence heavier than any words. Silas rode ahead, his back straight, his posture rigid, as if afraid that if he looked back, he'd see her leave. But Eleanor didn't leave. She couldn't. Because every time she looked at those boys, she saw her own students, the ones who'd come to school with empty bellies and full hearts, the ones who'd whispered secrets into her ear like prayers. And she knew, this wasn't just a job. It was a calling. When they finally reached the ranch, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Blackridge wasn't just a homestead, it was a kingdom carved from stone and sky. A 2-story log cabin with a stone chimney stood at the center, surrounded by barns, stables, and fields that stretched to the horizon. Smoke curled from the chimney. Horses grazed in the pasture. And yet, for all its grandeur, the place felt empty. Hollow. Like a body without a soul. Silas dismounted first, then helped her down, his hand brushing hers for only a second before he stepped away. "This is your home now," he said, voice low. "For as long as you choose to stay." She didn't answer. Just walked to the porch, where the boys stood like sentinels, their eyes wide with fear. She knelt before them, not too close, not too far, just enough to meet their gaze. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "But you can call me Miss Ellie, or just Ellie. Whichever feels right." Thomas looked at his father, then back at her. "Pa says you're gonna be our ma." She didn't flinch. "I'm not here to replace your ma. I'm here to walk beside you. To teach you. To listen. To be present." Jacob shifted his weight, his fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. "You gonna leave?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "Only if you ask me to." That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, mending a tear in Jacob's shirt. Silas stood by the window, watching the stars. "They haven't spoken to anyone since their mother died," he said quietly. "Not even me." She didn't look up. Grief doesn't speak in words. It speaks in silence. And silence can be healed with patience. He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "You really believe that?" "I know it," she replied. And in that moment, the line between employer and employee, stranger and guardian, vanished like smoke in the wind. Because what they were building wasn't a family. It was a covenant. And covenants, unlike contracts, were written not in ink, but in trust. Weeks passed like dust on the wind, quiet, steady, and full of unspoken understanding. Eleanor didn't impose herself, didn't demand affection. She simply showed up. Every morning, she rose before dawn to stoke the fire, brew coffee, and pack lunches for the boys. She taught them not just from books, but from life, how to read the stars, how to plant seeds, how to mend a fence with rope and patience. She read to them at night, Longfellow, Dickens, even Mark Twain, her voice soft but steady, filling the silence that had haunted the cabin for years. And slowly, ever so slowly, the boys began to thaw. Thomas started asking questions, about history, about justice, about why the world was so cruel. Jacob began to speak without stuttering, first to the horses, then to the dogs, then to her. One evening, as they sat on the porch shelling peas, Jacob looked up at her and said, "You're not like the other ladies." She smiled faintly. "How so?" "They wanted pa money. You want us." Her throat tightened. No one had ever seen her so clearly. Not her father, who'd died in debt. Not her sister, who'd married a gambler and vanished. Not even the townsfolk who called her, the poor teacher, behind closed doors. But these boys, they saw her. And that was the rarest gift of all. Silas watched from the corral, his expression unreadable. He didn't interfere, didn't praise, just stood there, his hands resting on the fence, his eyes holding hers like a promise. That night, during a thunderstorm that shook the pines, Jacob woke screaming from a nightmare. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran to his room, held him until his breathing slowed, and sang him a lullaby her own mother had taught her. When she finally returned to her room, she found Silas standing in the hallway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something she couldn't name. You didn't have to do that, he rasped. They're not your sons. She met his gaze, unflinching. They're not yours either. Not really. Not until you stop hiding from them. He flinched as if struck. I'm not hiding. Aren't you? She asked softly. You feed them, clothe them, protect them, but you don't see them. You don't let them see you. He looked away, his jaw tight. What if they see me, and hate what they find? Then you'll have to be brave enough to stay, she said. And in that moment, the wall between them cracked, not with anger, but with truth. Because love wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. And presence required courage. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it burst forth like a promise kept. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth. Birds returned to the pines. And in the newly tilled garden behind the cabin, Eleanor stood taller, stronger, her hands calloused from axe and plow, her laughter louder than the river. She didn't become Silas's wife overnight. Didn't wear a ring. Didn't change her name. But one morning, as they stood by the creek washing linens, Thomas looked up from the soap suds and said, Pa says you're gonna marry him. Eleanor froze. Does he? He says you're the only one who's ever stayed. She looked at Silas, who stood nearby, his expression unreadable. Is that true? He didn't look away. It's true. She set down the shirt she was wringing out, walked to him, and took his hands in hers, rough, warm, steady. Then ask me properly. He didn't laugh. Didn't hesitate. He knelt on one knee, not in grandeur, but in humility, and said, Eleanor Whitmore, I need a mother for my sons. But more than that, I need a partner for my soul. Will you stay? Not for shelter. Not for security. But for us. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, but of awe. No man had ever given her that kind of space. Not her father. Not the preacher. Not even the women who called themselves her friends. They'd all wanted her to fit. To obey. To disappear. But Silas, he wanted her to be. And that was the rarest gift of all. They stood beneath the old oak tree that marked the edge of Blackridge, exchanged vows they wrote themselves, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted of soap, sweat, and something deeper, peace. No guests. No preacher. Just two souls who'd found each other in the wreckage of the world and decided to build something new. Word spread, of course. Some called it scandalous. Others called it brave. But those who knew them, the trapper who left pelts on their porch, the widow who brought bread, the boy Thomas taught to ride, called it right. Years later, travelers would pass through the valley and ask about the woman who'd once been a poor teacher. But the locals would smile and point to the garden, now overflowing with beans and sunflowers, to the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, to the woman reading to children on the porch. She's not a teacher anymore, they'd say. She's the heart of Blackridge. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the echo of her voice in the pines, not pleading, not bargaining, but declaring, I'm here. And I'm staying. Because in the end, it wasn't gold that saved them. It was the choice to stand, together. In a world that measured worth in land and coin, she taught them that the truest wealth is found not in what you own, but in who you choose to love.